At my father-in-law's Sunday dinner, the air was thick with the smell of expensive roast beef and even more expensive tension. Gregory Whitman slammed his silver fork down onto the porcelain plate with a loud clang that made everyone jump. He looked me dead in the eye, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "Let's stop pretending, Isabella. You're a burden on this family," he said, his voice echoing through the silent dining room. The room went completely silent as the other guests stared at their laps, refusing to meet my gaze. My husband, Julian Whitman, simply stared at his plate like I didn't even exist sitting right next to him. Gregory continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive with every word. "You bring nothing to this table. No wealth, no influence, and certainly no legacy," he barked. My chest tightened until it felt like I couldn't breathe, and I felt the familiar sting of tears in my eyes. But Gregory had no idea that just this morning, I had received a sealed legal notice in the mail. It confirmed that I had just been named the sole inheritor of a hidden global estate that spans across 3 different continents. Julian told me to just ignore his father again as we drove home in a heavy, suffocating silence. But the next morning at breakfast, Gregory doubled down on his cruelty, mocking my low-level job at a small non-profit consultancy. He laughed while he read the financial news, suggesting that my little salary wouldn't even pay for the dry cleaning of his silk ties. I didn't say a word as I finished my coffee and headed to my office, but my mind was miles away. Once I was safely at my desk, I quietly logged into a secure server and approved a major international transfer. It was connected to one of the massive estate holdings I now controlled, but nobody in the office realized I was the signature authority behind the billion-dollar move. While my coworkers chatted about their weekend plans, I received an urgent encrypted message on my private phone. "Urgent. Global estate verification required." The screen flashed in bright red letters. I realized right then that someone important had finally started digging into my real identity. The quiet life I had carefully maintained was starting to crumble, and the world was beginning to notice the Monroe assets. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through my grandmother's old legal trust files, and what I found left me breathless. The portfolio contained luxury properties in New York, London, Dubai, and Singapore, all quietly managed under a complex web of shell foundations. Gregory had absolutely no idea that I had been completely financially independent for years while he treated me like a charity case. Later that evening, Julian completely forgot our wedding anniversary while he spent an hour praising his father's business genius on the phone. It hurt to realize that my own husband was more impressed by his father's local fortune than he was by our life together. As I sat alone in the dark living room, a private estate lawyer called my personal line with a voice full of concern. "They're beginning to notice the Monroe assets, Isabella," he warned me in a low whisper. He told me that large financial institutions were starting to flag the sudden movement of such massive wealth. I knew that I couldn't stay invisible forever, but I wasn't ready for the storm that was coming. My grandmother's secret was finally out in the open, and I was the only one who could protect it. A few days later, Gregory introduced me at a high society charity event as Julian's dependent wife, a title that felt like a slap in the face. He laughed loudly and told a group of wealthy donors, "She's lucky we even tolerate her presence in this house." I kept a polite smile plastered on my face, but internally, I was shaken to my core. I wasn't feeling shame because of his insults. I was terrified by how close he was getting to the truth about the estate without even knowing it. Every time he called me a burden, it felt like he was walking through a minefield that was about to explode. I watched him boast about his local real estate projects, knowing that I legally owned more property than his entire family combined. After the event, I noticed a group of men in suits watching me from across the ballroom. They didn't look like the usual socialites. They looked like hunters who had finally found their target. I realized then that being the owner of the Monroe Global Estate meant I would always have a target on my back. Gregory's petty insults were the least of my worries as the real players began to move onto the board. The situation became even more dangerous when an offshore property I owned in Monaco flagged several suspicious access attempts. My security team reported that someone was trying to illegally reassign ownership documents using stolen credentials. I rushed home and spent hours securing the digital vault system that was tied directly to the Monroe estate. Suddenly, the system flashed a bright red warning across my laptop screen. Unauthorized family-linked access detected. My heart stopped when the logs revealed that Gregory's own financial advisor was the one behind the breach. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was a coordinated attack on my inheritance. Gregory was so desperate for more wealth that he was willing to steal from the very woman he called a burden. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that my own family was the biggest threat to my grandmother's legacy. I had to act fast before they found a way to bypass the remaining security protocols. I started moving the assets into a high-security lockdown mode, cutting off any indirect access points they might try to use. The war for the Monroe estate had officially started, and Gregory had fired the first shot. In the middle of the night, a private encrypted message from my late grandmother finally unlocked on my computer. I felt like she was standing in the room with me as I read her words. "If they ever call you a burden, Isabella, it means they are close to what you own." I froze in my chair as the realization hit me like a physical blow. She had known exactly what kind of man Gregory Whitman was, and she had known this day would eventually come. She had spent years preparing the estate to withstand the greed of people who only saw me as an obstacle. Her letter explained that the insults were a tactic to make me feel small so I wouldn't realize my own power. I stayed up until dawn reading through her notes, feeling a new sense of purpose growing inside me. She hadn't just left me money, she had left me a shield to protect myself from the people I thought were my family. I realized that Gregory's arrogance was his biggest weakness, and I was going to use it against him. I wasn't just a granddaughter anymore. I was the guardian of a global empire, and I was finally ready to stop hiding in the shadows. At the next mandatory family dinner, Gregory demanded that I stop pretending to work at my non-profit job. He leaned over the table and told me I should focus on serving the family properly instead of wasting time on meaningless charity. Julian said absolutely nothing to defend me, as usual, and kept his eyes fixed on his dinner plate. Just as Gregory was about to launch into another lecture, my phone buzzed with a high-priority alert. "London Estate Board meeting in progress. Your approval needed," the message read. Gregory saw me check the screen and smirks with pure condescension. "Does even your little low-level job interrupt our family dinner now?" he asked mockingly. He had no idea that I was actually being summoned to approve a multi-million-dollar estate acquisition in the heart of London. I felt a surge of secret power as I excused myself to take a quick work call in the hallway. While Gregory complained about my lack of respect, I was making a decision that would change the skyline of a major world city. I walked back into the dining room with a calm smile, knowing that I had just out-earned Gregory's entire annual profit in less than 5 minutes. From the hallway, I used my phone to authorize a massive restructuring of a commercial district in London that was owned by the Monroe estate. I didn't realize it at the time, but my decision had a direct and devastating impact on Gregory's own business interests. Suddenly, Gregory's most important business partner lost access to a major development deal because the ownership structure had changed. Midway through our dessert, Gregory's phone rang, and his face turned a strange shade of gray as he listened to the caller. "The London acquisition just changed ownership structure unexpectedly," he repeated to the table, looking completely confused for the first time. He started barking orders at his assistant over the phone, trying to figure out who had the power to block his deal. He looked at me with suspicion for a split second, but then laughed at the idea that I could have anything to do with international real estate. He assumed it was a rival corporation or a foreign government that had stepped in. I watched him scramble to save his failing deal, realizing that the burden at his table was the one who had just pulled the rug out from under him. Gregory became obsessed with investigating who had authorized the sudden estate shifts that were ruining his business plans. He spent all his time in his home office, shouting into the phone and assuming it was an external competitor trying to sabotage him. Julian pulled me aside and warned me that his father was becoming increasingly unstable. "My dad is getting obsessed with this Monroe name he keeps seeing in the legal filings," Julian told me with a worried look. I quietly realized that Gregory was circling closer and closer to the truth about my secret identity every day. He was hiring private investigators and financial experts to trace the money back to its source. I knew that my time in the shadows was running out, but I needed to wait for the right moment to reveal everything. Every time I heard Gregory mention the Monroe estate, with a mix of fear and respect, it was hard to keep a straight face. He was treating the estate like a ghost that was haunting his business, never realizing the ghost was sleeping in his guest room. I continued to work my low-level job, but my nights were spent coordinating with lawyers to keep Gregory one step behind the truth. I decided to take a secret trip to physically visit a secured estate branch in Monaco to check on my assets. When I arrived, the high-level staff treated me with the utmost respect as the consulting authority for the entire region. While I was reviewing the security logs, I saw a familiar name on the restricted inquiry list. Gregory Whitman had been trying to gain access to the vault using every legal trick his lawyers could think of. He had no legal right to even be in the building, but he was clearly trying to force his way in anyway. I saw photos of his financial advisor lurking near the entrance, trying to bribe the security guards for information. It was clear that Gregory's greed had moved from business competition to outright criminal behavior. I authorized a new set of security protocols that would flag Gregory's name across every estate property globally. I wanted to make sure he couldn't take a single step toward my inheritance without me knowing about it. As I walked through the luxury offices, I realized that I was no longer afraid of him. He was a small man chasing a giant, and I was the one who controlled the path he was walking on. When I returned home, I found that Julian was being pressured by Gregory to get me to sign a series of financial disclosures. Gregory told him that as a dependent, I needed to prove that I wasn't hiding any debts that could hurt the family's credit. Julian hesitated for a long time when I asked him why his father was so interested in my personal finances. I began to see a very dangerous and painful pattern. Julian wasn't defending me against his father's attacks. Instead, he was simply managing his father's expectations and trying to keep the peace at my expense. He was more afraid of upsetting Gregory than he was of betraying his own wife. I looked at the man I had married and realized that I was completely alone in this house. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a problem that needed to be handled for his father's sake. I refused to sign the documents, which led to a massive argument that lasted until the early hours of the morning. Julian called me selfish, using his father's words like they were his own. That was the moment I realized my marriage was just another cage Gregory had built to keep me under his control. The next day, my estate lawyer called me for a secure briefing and revealed the true scope of my inheritance. I learned that I officially owned over 80 luxury properties, multiple international investment firms, and controlling shares in dozens of global trusts. Every single asset was registered under one name, Isabella Monroe. As I looked at the global estate map spread out on my screen, Gregory's family fortune suddenly looked incredibly small and insignificant. He was a big fish in a very small pond, but I was the ocean. The lawyer told me that the Monroe estate was now one of the top private landholders in the entire world. I felt a strange mix of terror and excitement as I realized the true level of power I now held in my hands. My grandmother hadn't just left me a comfortable life, she had left me the ability to change the world. I spent the afternoon studying the financial reports, realizing that I could shut down Gregory's entire operation with a single phone call if I wanted to. But I knew that a direct attack wasn't the right way to handle this. I needed to let Gregory's own arrogance lead him into the trap my grandmother had set for him years ago. The first major power shift happened during a joint venture meeting where Gregory was trying to secure a massive new partnership. He was in the middle of a grand presentation when several board members informed him that his proposal had been overridden. My estate assets had quietly blocked his financial plans because they didn't meet our new sustainability requirements. Gregory lost his influence in the room instantly as the other investors began asking, "Who exactly is this Isabella Monroe who has the power to stop a Whitman deal?" I sat in the back of the room, pretending to take notes for my little non-profit job, while Gregory panicked internally. He tried to hide his fear behind his usual mask of arrogance, but I could see his hands shaking as he packed up his laptop. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, trying to figure out which of his rivals was using the Monroe name to humiliate him. He never once looked at me, the person he had called a decorative spouse, just hours earlier. I realized that my invisibility was my greatest weapon, but it wouldn't last much longer as the whispers about my name started to spread through the corporate world. Gregory tried to humiliate me one last time at a prestigious business gala, standing on stage and calling me a decorative spouse in front of hundreds of people. He laughed and told the crowd that I was lucky to be married into a family with such a strong legacy. But just as he finished his insult, the event organizers stepped up to the microphone with a huge announcement. "We would like to thank the Monroe Global Estate for funding tonight's entire expansion initiative and every single table in this room," they said with deep respect. The entire ballroom went completely silent as people began to whisper and look around for the mysterious owner. Gregory froze on the stage, his face turning a bright, angry red as he realized he had just been upstaged by the very name that was haunting him. He looked like he wanted to scream, but he had to maintain his public image while the crowd applauded my estate. I caught his eye for a second and gave him a small, knowing smile that made his jaw drop. He didn't know the truth yet, but he knew that something was horribly wrong. The burden was the only reason his favorite charity event was even happening, and the irony was finally starting to burn him. When we got home that night, Julian finally broke down and admitted the truth. "My father is convinced that you're hiding something big, Isabella," he said, his voice full of a new kind of fear. He asked me directly what I was hiding and why my name was showing up in the Monroe legal filings. I stayed silent, watching him carefully to see if he was asking because he cared about me or because his father had told him to find out. I realized that Julian was caught in the middle of a war he wasn't prepared to fight. He wanted the truth, but I wasn't sure if he could handle it without running back to Gregory. I told him that some secrets were kept for a reason, and that he should have defended me when his father called me a burden. Julian looked ashamed, but I could tell he was still looking for a way to satisfy Gregory's curiosity. I went to bed knowing that my own husband was now part of the investigation against me. Every conversation we had was being reported back to the man who wanted to steal my inheritance. The walls of the Whitman house were closing in, and I knew I had to make my move before they found a way to break into my accounts. A few days later, my security team alerted me to a highly coordinated attempt to access my New York property holdings. The digital trail led directly back to Gregory's lead financial consultant once again. This wasn't just digging for information anymore. It was an active attempt to commit identity theft on a global scale. They were trying to forge my signature on transfer documents to move the Monroe assets into Gregory's private accounts. I realized that Gregory had moved beyond greed and into full-blown criminal desperation. He was willing to risk everything, including his own family's reputation, to get his hands on my grandmother's money. I contacted my lawyers and told them to prepare the full evidence of the breach for the authorities. This was no coincidence, and I had the digital fingerprints to prove exactly who was behind it. I felt a sense of cold clarity as I realized that Gregory had just handed me the evidence I needed to end his career forever. He thought he was a predator, but he was really just a thief who had been caught in the act. I sat in my office and watched the security logs, waiting for him to make one final fatal mistake that would expose him to the world. The final crack in Gregory's plan happened when a legal document from the Monroe estate accidentally surfaced during an internal audit of his company. Gregory was reviewing the papers when he saw my full name tied directly to billion-dollar international holdings. He physically stepped back from his desk, his face turning ghostly pale as the realization hit him. I wasn't his dependent wife. I was the most powerful financial force he had ever encountered. He sat in his office for hours, staring at the document and trying to process the fact that the woman he called a burden was actually his superior in every way. He realized that every deal he had lost and every partnership that had failed was because of me. The decorative spouse was the one who held the power to destroy his entire legacy with a single stroke of a pen. He was no longer the king of the Whitman family. He was a tenant in a world that I legally controlled. I watched from the hallway as he sat in the dark, a broken man who finally understood that his arrogance had blinded him to the truth. He had spent his whole life chasing wealth, only to realize that it had been sitting right in front of him all along. Gregory went into a state of total panic and started aggressively trying to force Julian into taking control of my finances. He shouted at Julian in the living room, demanding that he use his marital rights to seize my bank accounts and property deeds. But for the first time in his life, Julian looked at his father with a sense of disgust and refused to follow his orders. "I'm not going to steal from my wife, Dad," Julian said, his voice finally steady and firm. Their relationship fractured right there in front of me, the years of manipulation and control finally snapping under the pressure of Gregory's greed. Gregory was furious, calling Julian a traitor and threatening to disinherit him from the family business. But Julian didn't back down. He walked out of the room and left his father alone with his rage. I realized that my success had finally given Julian the courage he needed to stand up for himself. The Whitman family was falling apart, and Gregory was the only one left who didn't see it coming. He was a man without an army, fighting a war that he had already lost months ago. I felt a strange sense of pity for him, but I knew that accountability was the only way this could end. That night, I officially activated the full estate authority protections that my grandmother had designed for this exact moment. I moved every single global holding into a protected trust mode that required my personal biometric authorization for any changes. Gregory lost all of his indirect influence over several major assets overnight, and his business partners began calling him with news that their deals were being cancelled. He spent the entire night in his office, frantically trying to log into systems that were now completely locked out for him. He was a man who had always used money as a weapon, but now he found himself unarmed and vulnerable. I sat in the kitchen, drinking a cup of tea and listening to the sound of his world collapsing one phone call at a time. He had no idea that I was the one who had pulled the plug on his entire operation. I was no longer the burden he had insulted at the table. I was the force of nature that was sweeping his legacy away. By the time the sun came up, Gregory Whitman was a man with a big name and absolutely no power to back it up. The Monroe estate was finally secure, and the truth was ready to be revealed to the entire board of directors. The next morning, a multinational board meeting was called to discuss the sudden shifts in global estate ownership. Gregory stormed into the boardroom, expecting to be the one in charge as usual, but he was met with a shocking announcement. The legal counsel revealed that I held the controlling voting rights across several of the estate-backed corporations that Gregory depended on. Gregory's face turned from red to a deathly white as he looked around the room and saw the other board members looking at me with deep respect. He realized that his influence was gone, and he stormed out of the meeting in a blind rage. Whispers began spreading through the building like wildfire. "She's not just wealthy, she controls global assets." The woman they had all ignored for years was suddenly the most important person in the room. I sat at the head of the table and began the process of restructuring the companies to remove Gregory's toxic influence for good. I didn't have to raise my voice or make a scene. The legal documents spoke for themselves. Gregory was a ghost of the past, and I was the future they were all waiting for. The burden was gone, and the foundation was finally visible to everyone. During a private legal briefing later that day, a hidden clause in my grandmother's will was finally revealed to me. It stated that if I was ever labeled a burden or manipulated through my marriage ties, a full autonomous control mechanism would activate. I realized with a shock that Gregory had unknowingly triggered his own downfall the very moment he insulted me publicly at the dinner table. My grandmother had designed the estate to react to his behavior like a trap that was set decades in advance. Every insult he threw at me only served to give me more power over his life. It was a perfect, brilliant system of justice that protected me from the very people who were supposed to love me. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for my grandmother's wisdom and foresight. She knew that Gregory would never change, and she made sure he would pay for his cruelty with the only thing he cared about, his wealth. The more he tried to push me down, the higher the system lifted me up. I was the one in control because he couldn't control his own greed. The trap had closed, and Gregory was caught in a web of his own making, with no way to escape the consequences. Gregory cornered me in the hallway after the board meeting, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and pure terror. "You set me up, Isabella," he screamed, his voice echoing through the empty office wing. "You've been planning this for years, just waiting for the right moment to humiliate me." I looked at him with a calm, steady gaze that seemed to make him even angrier. "No, Gregory," I responded quietly. "I didn't set you up. You exposed yourself the moment you decided that my worth was based on your bank account." For the first time in his life, he looked genuinely afraid as he realized that he had no more leverage over me. He tried to say something else, but his voice failed him, and he just stood there shaking. He was a man who had always relied on fear to get what he wanted, but now he was the one who was terrified. I walked past him without a second glance, leaving him alone with the realization that his entire life was a lie. He had lost everything because he couldn't see the value of a person who didn't bring wealth or legacy to his table. The burden was finally off my shoulders, and the weight was now entirely on his.